She pressed an old sweater into my hands, her voice trembling as she whispered, "She'd want you to keep it." I thought it was just a piece of clothing, until I realized it carried not only my mother's memory, but a bond with the woman I never expected to feel so close to. I remember the way she stood in the doorway that evening, her silhouette softened by the golden light coming in through the kitchen window. She held something folded carefully in her hands, as though it were too fragile for the world outside her arms. When she stepped closer, I saw it, my mother's old sweater. The one she used to wear on chilly mornings when the house smelled of coffee and fresh bread. My stepmother's eyes lingered on me, uncertain, almost searching. Then, with a steadying breath, she reached out and placed the sweater into my hands. Her fingers brushed against mine, cool and trembling, and I felt a surprising weight settle between us. Not just the fabric, but everything it carried, the scent of old perfume that clung faintly to the fibers, the memory of laughter in the kitchen, the quiet hum of a presence now gone. "She'd want you to keep it," she said softly. The words landed in my chest with a heaviness I couldn't answer at first. I only nodded, swallowing hard against the sudden tightness in my throat. The sweater felt worn but gentle, the kind of softness that only comes from years of use. My thumb traced along the cuff as if I might find my mother's touch still lingering there. The air between us was still, but not empty. It was full of something unspoken, her sympathy, my grief, and the fragile thread of connection neither of us knew how to name. When I finally lifted my gaze to hers, I noticed how carefully she was watching me. Not as a stepmother forced into an inherited role, but as a woman who was trying to bridge a distance that had always existed between us. Her expression wasn't pity, it was understanding. And in that moment, I realized she had carried this sweater all day, waiting for the right time to let it go. I wanted to say something, thank you, maybe, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I let the silence speak. I stood there holding the sweater against my chest, and for the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel entirely alone in my grief. Her hand lifted slightly, as though she meant to touch my arm, then fell back at her side. Even that unfinished gesture said more than words could. She wanted to reach me, but she wasn't sure how close she was allowed to come. And in that hesitation, I felt the beginning of something I didn't yet understand. Later that night, the house seemed quieter than usual, as though it were listening to the echo of its own emptiness. I found myself in the living room, the sweater folded neatly across my lap. I wasn't wearing it yet, it felt too sacred, too bound to memory, but I kept running my hand over the soft fabric as though it might steady me. She came in without a word, barefoot, carrying 2 mugs of tea. The faint clink of porcelain was the only sound as she set one down in front of me. Her movements were deliberate, careful, as if she didn't want to startle the silence we were both caught inside. I looked up to thank her, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes that startled me, not pity, not obligation, but something closer to vulnerability. She lowered herself onto the couch beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence, though she kept a respectful distance. The steam curled between us, carrying the faint scent of chamomile. "I used to worry," she began, her voice so soft it almost blended with the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "Worry that I could never fit in her place. That no matter what I did, you'd see me as an intruder." Her words caught me off guard. I shifted, unsure of how to respond, but she didn't look at me right away. Instead, she traced the rim of her mug with one fingertip, her shoulders curving inward as if she were confessing something she'd never meant to say aloud. "I never wanted to replace her," she continued. "I just wanted to be someone you could trust." The admission hung in the air, tender and uncertain. I swallowed, the tea warming my palms though I hadn't taken a sip yet. For the first time, I saw her not as the woman who had married my father, not as a figure I had kept at arm's length, but as someone who was just as unsure, just as human, as I was. I let the silence stretch, then finally said, "I never thought of you as an intruder." The words were simple, but the way her shoulders eased told me they mattered. Her eyes lifted to mine then, clear and searching. For a long moment we held each other's gaze, the air charged with something unspoken. Our hands rested near each other on the couch armrest, close enough that the space between them felt like a question neither of us was ready to answer. In that quiet, I felt the first real thread of trust weaving itself between us. The days that followed carried a kind of fragile rhythm. Life didn't stop, there were still errands, meals, and laundry, but beneath those simple routines, something had shifted. I noticed it in the smallest things. The way she set an extra plate at the table without asking if I'd be home. The way she folded my clothes with deliberate care, smoothing the fabric as though every crease mattered. One evening, I came into the kitchen to find her standing by the stove, a kettle hissing softly beside her. The scent of lemon and mint drifted through the air, comforting in its simplicity. She turned at the sound of my footsteps, her expression brightening just slightly, just enough to feel intentional. "I thought you might like some tea," she said, holding out a mug. Her hands were steady, but when I reached for it, our fingers brushed. The contact was fleeting, yet it lingered like the warmth of the tea itself. I sat at the counter, watching her move about the kitchen. It struck me then how naturally she filled the quiet spaces of the house. She didn't command them the way my mother once did, but she tended to them, like someone nurturing a garden they weren't sure would ever bloom. When she came to sit across from me, the sweater I had left on the back of the chair caught her eye. She reached for it gently, almost reverently, folding it with practiced hands. Her touch was delicate, smoothing the sleeves as if she were touching memory itself. "You've been keeping it close," she murmured, her tone soft but not accusing. More like she was noticing, perhaps even approving. I nodded, unsure of what to say. "It helps," I admitted. Her eyes lifted to mine then, and for a moment I thought she might smile. Instead, she placed the folded sweater between us on the counter, as though it belonged not just to me but to the space we were slowly learning to share. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic words. Just the quiet clink of her spoon against the mug, the faint hum of the kettle cooling, and her presence steady across from me. But it was in these small things, the tea, the folding of fabric, the way her hand lingered an extra second on the sweater, that I began to feel something unfamiliar take root. It wasn't obligation. It wasn't mere politeness. It was care. And it was directed at me. It was late, later than either of us meant to be awake. The house had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that sinks deep into your skin, broken only by the ticking clock on the mantel. I found myself in the living room again, the sweater draped across my knees, its weight both comforting and heavy. She came in slowly, almost hesitantly, carrying her own cup of tea. She didn't ask if she could join me, she just settled into the far end of the couch, as though this was a ritual we had unknowingly begun. For a while, we spoke about ordinary things. The weather, the errands she had to run tomorrow, the small repairs around the house. But the conversation drifted, as it often does in the late hours, to more personal territory. She told me about her younger years, the dreams she once had of living in a city far away, the way life had quietly redirected her. There was a wistfulness in her voice, and I could see the shadow of those abandoned dreams in the way her gaze softened against the dark windowpane. At some point, she turned the question back on me. "And you? What do you see for yourself?" I hesitated. It wasn't the kind of question I was used to hearing from her. My friends might ask about jobs or plans, but she asked as if she truly cared about the answer. I stumbled through a reply, something about not knowing yet, about feeling caught between who I was and who I was supposed to become. Her expression grew thoughtful, almost tender. "You have more time than you think," she said softly. "Don't let anyone rush you into becoming someone you're not." The words should have been comforting, but the way she said them made my chest tighten. I looked at her then, really looked, at the curve of her shoulders under the lamplight, at the way her hair slipped loose around her face. For a moment, the air between us felt too thick, charged with something I couldn't name. She must have felt it too, because she looked away quickly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with a nervous flick of her fingers. "We should get some sleep," she said, though her voice didn't carry conviction. Her hand lingered for the briefest second on the armrest near mine, as though she had considered reaching out but changed her mind. That hesitation was louder than any words. It left me wondering if she was holding back for herself, or for me. And in the silence that followed, the space between us felt fragile, like a secret neither of us was ready to speak aloud. The tension from that night lingered in the days that followed, like a thread stretched taut but never pulled. I tried to go about things as usual, burying myself in errands and distractions, but the weight of her unspoken words, and my own silence, followed me everywhere. It came to a head one afternoon when I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to. Two neighbors stood outside the fence, their voices low but edged with judgment. They spoke her name in hushed tones, questioning her choices, whispering about how unnatural it was for her to live under the same roof with me now that my father was gone. Their words burned into me, sharp and bitter. I wanted to shout at them, to defend her, but I froze. All I could do was retreat into the house, my fists clenched and my chest tight. She found me later at the kitchen table, staring at the sweater folded in front of me as though it might offer an answer. She noticed immediately that something was wrong. Her hand brushed my shoulder gently as she leaned closer. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. I shook my head at first, not wanting to burden her, but the words spilled out anyway. "They talk about you. About us. Like they know anything." My voice cracked, the anger too close to the surface. Her expression didn't harden the way I expected. Instead, it softened with something I didn't recognize, relief, maybe, or gratitude that I cared enough to be hurt on her behalf. She drew in a slow breath, then reached across the table, her fingers finding mine. The touch was light, almost tentative, but when I didn't pull away, she let her hand rest there fully. "People will always talk," she said quietly. "They did when I first married your father. They do now. But their words don't have to define us." Her thumb brushed the back of my hand, an almost unconscious gesture that sent warmth up my arm. I met her eyes then, and for a moment the noise of the world outside vanished. There was just her steady gaze, her quiet strength, and the certainty in her touch. I hadn't realized how badly I needed that comfort until it was there. The distance between us, the careful space she always kept, seemed to dissolve in that small gesture. For the first time, I felt her not just as someone beside me, but as someone with me. And in that closeness, I sensed we had crossed an invisible line, one we could never step back over. That evening, I stepped outside with the sweater pulled over my shoulders. The air was cool, carrying the sharp scent of autumn leaves, and I wanted the quiet of the porch to clear my thoughts. The fabric held me close, its familiar softness grounding me in a way nothing else could. I didn't hear her at first, but then the door creaked, and she joined me with a blanket folded over her arm. She hesitated in the doorway, as if unsure whether to intrude, but then she came forward and sat beside me on the steps. The night was still, the stars faint against the glow of the street lamp, and our breaths rose in pale clouds that drifted together before fading. "You wear it well," she said softly, nodding to the sweater. Her voice carried something gentle, almost wistful. "She would have loved to see you in it." I lowered my eyes, my fingers tugging absently at the cuff. "It feels like she's still here, in a way. Like I can still carry her with me." She reached out then, slowly, deliberately, and adjusted the collar where it had slipped. Her fingers brushed the side of my neck, cool at first but quickly warming against my skin. The touch was brief, practical even, but it left behind a trail of heat that lingered long after her hand fell away. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it was heavy, charged, as though every unsaid word hovered just at the edge of being spoken. I turned my head slightly, and our eyes met. Hers held a depth I hadn't seen before, something that was part sorrow, part longing, and entirely human. "You don't have to carry all of this alone," she whispered. Her tone was steady, but her hand trembled where it rested against her lap, as though she was holding herself back. "I don't want you to carry it alone either," I admitted. My voice was low, barely louder than the crickets, but the words seemed to bind us in a way silence never could. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders softening. The blanket slipped a little from her grasp, and I reached out instinctively, catching it. Our hands overlapped in that small motion, and this time neither of us pulled away. The night pressed close around us, cool and quiet, but between her hand and mine there was warmth enough to change everything. In that simple, undeniable closeness, I knew the space we had been protecting for so long was no longer there. The next morning, the world felt different, not louder, not brighter, but steadier, as if the air between us had quietly rearranged itself. We didn't speak of what happened on the porch, of the way our hands lingered together or the silence that said more than words ever could. But the memory of it lingered in every glance, in the way we moved around each other, careful yet undeniably closer. I found her in the living room, sunlight spilling across the couch where she sat reading. The sweater rested beside me, folded neatly, a reminder of where all this had begun. For a moment I just stood in the doorway, watching her. There was a softness in her posture, the way her hair caught the light, that made something inside me ache. She looked up and smiled, small, hesitant, but real. "Sleep well?" I nodded, taking the chair across from her. "Better than I expected." The truth was, I hadn't slept much at all. My mind kept circling back to her hand over mine, the quiet strength of it, the way it felt like home in a way I hadn't known I was searching for. For a while, we spoke of simple things, the errands she planned to run, the weather turning colder, the neighbor's dog that barked at everything that passed. But beneath the ordinary words, there was an unshakable current, a closeness that neither of us needed to name to feel. At some point, she reached for the sweater, smoothing the sleeves as though grounding herself in the familiar. Then, almost without thinking, she held it out to me again. "You should keep it near," she said softly. "Not just for her, but for you." I took it, letting my fingers brush hers. This time, she didn't pull back. Instead, her hand lingered, warm and steady. "I don't know what comes next," I admitted, my voice low. "But I know I don't want to lose this." Her eyes lifted to mine, steady and full of something I could only call courage. "Then we don't have to," she whispered. She shifted then, just enough to sit closer. The distance between us dissolved as naturally as breathing. She let her head rest lightly against my shoulder, and I felt her exhale, as if she had been holding her breath for far too long. The sweater lay across our laps, not just a reminder of the past anymore, but a bridge to something new. In that quiet morning light, I understood, grief had brought us together, but it didn't have to define us. What mattered now was the warmth we had chosen to hold on to, together.